العالمين وأفضل الصلاة وأتم التسليم على سيدنا ونبينا وحبيبنا محمد سيد الأولين والآخرين إمام المتقين النبي المبعوث رحمة للعالمين وعلى آله وأصحابه وأتباعه إلى يوم الدين. اللهم فقهنا في الدين وعلمنا التأويل وألهمنا رشدنا يا رب العالمين. Alhamdulillah, in our lessons on the Mukhtasar of Imam al-Quduri, in which we have reached Babu Khiyar al-Aib, Babu Khiyar al-Aib. We'll be looking today at a very important component related to the rulings of trade, because the fuqaha are focused on dealing with the rulings themselves, but there's a dimension of ethics that is important to appreciate and be conscious of, and the mere study of the rulings of fiqh on its own is not sufficient from being appreciative of these rulings or these values. Babu Khiyar al-Aib, the option of cancellation due to there being a defect. Imam al-Haskafi in Ad-Durr al-Muntaqa fi Sharh al-Multaqa points out that وَكِتْمَانُ الْعَيْبِ كِتْمَانُهُ حَرَامٌ. Right? Concealing a defect in an item of sale is prohibited. Right? So if you're aware of a defect, concealing it is prohibited, meaning that it's sinful to conceal. You sell something knowing that it has a defect, but you do not inform the other party of the defect. This is haram. Right? So the person is sinful. So diyanatan, religiously, you have to repent. And because it relates to the rights of another, you'd have to ask their forgiveness as well, right? As part of repentance. And he continues, وَيُفَسَّقُ. Right? The person who hides defects in their transactions, right? And of course, يُفَسَّقْ إِنْ اعْتَادَ ذَلك. If they continually do that, such a person is deemed a fasiq. They may pray, fast, give charity and all these things, but in their transaction, they hide the defects of what they transact in. Such a person is a fasiq, is morally corrupt. And then he also says, وَتُرَدُّ شَهَادَتُهُ فِي قَوْلٍ. And some even said that his witness is rejected. And there's tafsil in that, right? He points to the fact that fi qawl, and he quotes that from al-Bazzaziyah. Okay, Babu Khiyar al-Aib. The commentator says min idafat al-shay' ila sababihi. This is ascribing a matter to its cause, meaning al-khiyar alladhi sababuhu al-aib. Right? Al-khiyar alladhi sababuhu al-aib. The option of cancellation that arises due to there being aib, a blemish in the item of sale. So the commentator explains that al-ayb. Where's your copy? Here, the copy of the book. The Lubab. العيب لغة ما يخلو عنه أصل الفطرة السليمة مما يعد به ناقصا. The عيب is that which the natural state of something when sound is free of. That is the عيب. That is the defect, which if found would cause the thing to be considered deficient. ناقص. This is quoted from Al-Fath. And then he says, وشرعا ما أوجب نقصان الثمن في عادة التجار. And in some copies there's a mistake. It shouldn't be التجارة, it should be التجار. Right? Is that which causes, the definition of a defect in transactions is that which results in the diminishment of the price of something according to the norms of the tujjar, of the traders, of those who trade in that thing. Of course, he mentions thaman here, the price, but as mentioned in Hashir ibn Abdin, it's actually al-qima, because there's two related concepts. There's the market value of something, and then there's the market, and then there's the price. Al-qima, so the thaman, right, the price is ما تراضى عليه المتعاقدان. Right? The thaman, the price, is what the two transacting parties agreed upon. Whatever the price was. Whereas the qima is ما يقوم به الشيء. يعني عند التجار أو في السوق is the market value of something is the price ascribed to it in the marketplace, right, by those who transact in that thing. Why? Because something could be sold for more than the market value or less than the market value, right? So the qima is the market value of something. The price is what they agreed upon. It could be the same, it could be different, right? And we'll see in Babul, in the next chapter, which is on al-bay' al-fasid, the corrupt transaction, why this is significant. So a defect is that which causes a diminishment of the market value of something. That thing in the market would be now sold for less than it was without it. Because some things don't diminish the market value. Right? The color of the book, for example, right? You got a copy that's red. What color is your copy of the book? Yeah, although there's other things that diminish the value of that one. Or, like my one's so banged up anyway that can't. Right? So and in the Majalla, item 336, he says, البيع المطلق يقتضي السلامة المبيع من العيوب. An unconditioned sale entails it being free of defects. If I sell you this mic for $100, unconditioned meaning I did not mention that there's a faults in it or did not condition it. I'm selling it to you as is. it entails that it does not have a aib. It does not have anything that would diminish its value in the marketplace. Right? Because an item of sale being free of defects is a wasfun matlub, is a quality that is sought. Right? وصف المطلوب عادة. Right? وعرفا والمطلوب عادة كالمشروط شرطا. And something that is customarily sought, it's as if legally, is as if contractually stipulated. Right? So it's something you bought something, the fact that it's sound is expected. It's as if it was stipulated. Right? And this is quoted from this in the commentary on the Majalla. This is mentioned from Majma' al-Abhur. Majma' al-Anhur, sorry. Okay. So you can look at item 336 of the Majalla. The option, some options need to be stipulated, right? Such as khiyar al-shart. Right? The option to cancel needs to be stipulated. But khiyar al-aib, the option to cancel due to defect, does not require stipulation. Number two, there's لا يتوقت. There's no time limit for it. Even if you discovered the fault much later, as long as you can establish that it existed with the seller, it's not time limited. And there's other rulings related to it, but so that's the definition of the aib. And he mentions, so Imam al-Quduri says rahimahullah ta'ala, إذا اطلع المشتري على عيب في المبيع فهو بالخيار إن شاء أخذه بجميع الثمن وإن شاء رده. If the buyer discovers a fault or defect in the item of sale, then he has the option. If he wishes, he can take the item as is for the full price, or if he wishes, he can return it for a full refund. And if he discovers a defect, right? Aib, Al-Maydani says, كان عند البائع, a defect that was present, that existed with the seller. And that's what the challenge arises, right? The buyer, the seller, the ba'i' might accept it. But if he rejects it, then they can either come to an agreement or take it to court. وَلَمْ يَرَهُ الْمُشْتَرِي عِنْدَ الْبَيْعِ, and the buyer did not see it at the time of sale. Right? So if I said, okay, you want to buy the mic? Okay, come inspect it. And there's a huge scratch. Now, then the fuqaha distinguish between al-aib al-zahir wal-aib al-batin. A manifest defect, which ما يدرك عند أدنى اختبار. That a basic test would make it obvious. Right? And there's the aib al-batin, and a hidden defect, which would require more extensive investigation to find. And then there is more hidden than that, which you may not discover except through thorough investigation. Because if you saw the defect and it's a clear defect, if the buyer saw the aib and it's a clear aib, then he doesn't have the right of return. But it is recommended, right? So it's haram to hide a defect. But even upon inspection, because you could say, here it is, check it out. But even if the aib should be clear, because the person may not know about those things, it is min al-nush, is bayanul aib. If the aib is hidden, it's obligatory to make it known. But even if it's evident, it's recommended to make it clear. Right? And two of the critical qualities that the Prophet ﷺ mentioned for blessing in trade is a sadaqah wa nasaha, or tanasaha. If the buyer and seller are truthful and have concern for the interest of the other party, then burika lahuma fi bay'ihima. Then their transaction will be blessed. Which is why it is religiously praiseworthy to seek out honest and upright people to deal with, because it'll make your transactions a lot more blessed. And to safeguard your worldly rights too, of course. وَلَيْسَ لَهُ أَن يُمْسِكَهُ وَيَأْخُذَ النُّقْصَانِ. But it is not the right of the buyer to keep the item of sale and to demand the loss in value. Why? Because of the principle that we've already seen, لأن الأوصاف لا يقابلها شيء من الثمن. Because qualities, awsaf, you cannot ascribe a material price, a transactional price to them. So unless إلا أن يرضى به البائع, unless the seller agrees to it. And who has to... Now, what if you bought it in one place and the buyer took it home and discovered the defect? Right? Or I bought something in Istanbul, I came back to Toronto, I discovered a defect. Right? مؤنة الرد على المشتري. The cost of returning the item to the place where the transaction took place is upon the buyer. This is mentioned by Hashid ibn Abdin. Right? وسلمه لبائعه في موضع العقد لأن مؤنة الرد على المشتري. When you're returning it to where you bought the thing from is by default upon the buyer. Then what is aib? He says, rahimahullah ta'ala, وَكُلُّ مَا أَوْجَبَ نُقْصَانَ الثَّمَنِ فِي عَادَةِ التُّجَّارِ فَهُوَ عَيْبٌ. Everything that results in a diminishing of the price according to the norms of traders in that matter is a defect. And of course, what's meant by thaman is al-qima here. Okay? Is the qima, the market value, not the price. Ibn Abdin makes clear anything that causes a diminishment in the price, he says, وَلَوْ يَسِيرًا, even if a little bit. Because the sign of the defect being harmful is the price going down. That's an objective standard. And then he gives examples of, and here just as a point of benefit, Ibn Abidin comes up with a tahqiq on this point. It's in volume 4, page 71. He says that what is mentioned in the work, in the mutun, etc., here is a general criteria. It's not a comprehensive principle of what a defect is. And he goes into a lengthy discussion and he comes up with a more nuanced criterion, because one of the issues is mas'alatul qalanswa. If you bought a cap and it's too small, you have the right of return, even though it still has the same market value. Right? Or you bought a jacket and it's not the right size. And a number of the commentators on the Majalla followed Ibn Abdin on this. Amongst them Rustum Baz, who was a Christian, who wrote a commentary on the Majalla. And there's a few of these Christian commentators in the Ottoman time who wrote, the Hanafis have several works written by Christians in our madhab. Because the law of the land. Right? But Allama Al-Atasi in his Sharh on the Majalla, and you can find it volume 2, page 294, disagrees. And he shows that Ibn Abidin, rahimahullah ta'ala, joined between two separate issues into one. That the khiyarul aib, the criterion for what is considered a defect, is what is mentioned in the majority, in the works of the madhab, which is anything that diminishes the market value, according to those who transact in those matters. That is the aib. The other issues that he tried to encompass with the khiyarul aib, this is, in his definition of khiyarul aib, this is a different type of option of cancellation, which is called khiyaru fawatil wasf al-marghub, or something called this khiyarul wasf, the option of cancellation due to a missing quality. Because there's nothing wrong with the jacket itself. The jacket's fine, it's just too small for you. It's not a defect. This is a missing quality, which is it doesn't fit. So you have an option of cancelling there, but it's not khiyarul aib, this is khiyarul wasf. And the khiyarul wasf can also arise, for example, if you purchased something on condition that, with a particular condition. So for example, you got a saw. Says, I have a very large tree in my backyard of this type. Does this saw cut that tree? So the person says yes. So I said, well, I want to stipulate that contractually. I'm buying this saw on condition that this saw is strong enough to cut a whatever kind of oak tree. And turns out it doesn't. That's not a defect, because the market value of the thing is what the market value is. But it's called خيار فوات الوصف المرغوب عادة. That's the whole title. Is the option that arises due to a quality that is typically sought after, or that you contractually stipulated that you were seeking, and it was a reasonable quality. Right? If you stipulated that you're buying a cow on condition that the cow jump over the moon, the sale's valid. The condition that it jump over the moon is lahu, or that the cow should say moo at the beginning of every hour. That's lahu. That's not of consideration. Anyways. Then he mentions a bunch of uyub. So he says, وَالْإِبَاقُ وَالْبَوْلُ فِي الْفِرَاشِ وَالسَّرِقَةُ عِيبٌ فِي الصَّغِيرِ. Ibaq, for a slave to run away, or a child to urinate in bed, and theft are a defect in a child. ما لم يبلغ, as long as they don't hit puberty. فإذا بلغ فليس بعيب حتى يعوده بعد البلوغ. So if someone bought a slave that used to urinate as a child, the fact that they urinated as a child is not a defect unless they also urinate after as an adult. Because these things are ascribed to a child because of immaturity. But once they hit maturity, the asl is that they would no longer run away or urinate in bed or steal. But if they continue doing it as an adult, it means it's not due to immaturity, but rather it is due to a defect of a corrupt state. And والبخر والدفر عيب في الجارية, and having bad breath, or bakhar is having bad oral smell, والدفر smelling bad, right? Like the armpit, or some even said like there being bad smell coming from your nose, is عيب في الجارية, is a defect in the female. وليس بعيب في الغلام, but not in the male. This of course applies not only to sale. These uyub also apply to ijara. You hired a servant and they stink, right? Now, if they're working indoors, then the fact that they stink would be a aib. You could cancel the contract. I mean, if they only stink because they didn't take a bath, you could reasonably demand that, please, when you come to work tomorrow, please take a bath. But if it's due to, you have a right. But if they work in the field for you, then the fact that they have bad breath or bad bodily smell is not an excuse for you to fire them. إلا أن يكون من داء, unless it's due to some kind of disease. والزنا وولد الزنا عيب في الجارية دون الغلام, and engaging in zina and being born of zina is a aib in the female, not in the male, unless they engage in so much zina that's a source of notoriety for their master. نسأل الله العافية. And if someone, and interestingly, if you look in the Dur, right, they say disbelief is a aib in, if you know, in the slave, but also if you hired somebody. And this is, of course, in a Muslim land, assuming that they're a believer. But the fuqaha also say, وَكَذَا الرَّفْضُ وَالْإِعْتِزَالِ. If you hired somebody and they turn out to be Rafidi or a Mu'tazilite, said because a person of Ahl Sunnah would want to keep a polite distance. But this would also return to social context. It's not an absolute. And here, and this is in Hashia, page 76. Ibn Abidin here mentions an important point about the Rafida. He says, وأنت خبير بأن الصحيح في المعتزلة والرافضة وغيرهم من المبتدعة أنه لا يحكم بكفرهم. It's very important. It says, and you're well aware that the sound opinion about the Mu'tazilites, which are the rational, those who veered in excess due to over-rationalization of certain points, a historic sect, but has even modern manifestations, وَالرَّافِضَةِ, and the Shia, and others of the people of innovation, one does not deem them to be disbelievers. وَإِن سَبُّوا الصَّحَابَةِ, even if they curse the Sahaba, وَاسْتَحَلُّوا قَتْلَنَا, and even if they deem it lawful to kill us, بِشُبْهَةِ دَلِيلٍ, by some semblance of an argument. بِخِلَافِ الْغُلَاةِ مِنْهُمْ, as opposed to those who are to go to excesses amongst them, right? القائلين بنبوة علي, of those who affirm prophethood for Sayyidina Ali, which is some deviated sects of the Shia sect, right? والقاذفين للصديقة, and those who accuse Sayyidah Aisha falsely. You can find this Hashiyat ibn Adin, volume 4, page 76. It's also important. This is why sometimes you find this is in the chapter on Khiyar al-Aib, but you find something related to the ruling on the Shia, that we do not affirm their disbelief. So the same issue is discussed, half a dozen different places in Hashiyat ibn Abdin. Anyways. Then what happens if a new blemish arises? So it's already a blemish. So you bought the microphone and it had a fault. But then a new defect arose after purchase. So what do you do? Because if you were to return it now, because the buyer is in a state of harm because he's acquired something that had, and this is called عيب قديم, an old defect, a defect that was present with the seller. But then a new defect has arisen with the buyer. So if it's returned to the seller would have to take on a harm. So how do you juggle with this? There's a few scenarios. So he'll explain. وَإِذَا حَدَثَ عِنْدَ الْمُشْتَرِ عَيْبٌ, right? If there arises a new defect with the buyer, ثُمَّ اطَّلَعَ عَلَى عَيْبٍ قَدِيمٍ كَانَ عِنْدَ الْبَائِعِ ثُمَّ اطَّلَعَ عَلَى عَيْبٍ كَانَ عِنْدَ الْبَائِعِ. Then he discovers a defect, meaning an old defect that was present with the seller. فَلَهُ أَنْ يَرْجِعَ بِنُقْصَانِ الْعَيْبِ. Here, فَلَهُ أي يحق له. The buyer has the right to go back to the seller, to the ba'i', بنقصان العيب, with the diminishment of value that arises due to the defect. Right? ولا يرد المبيع, and one cannot, and it's not his right to demand a refund unless the buyer agrees. إلا أن يرضى البائع. Right? Because if the buyer had the right of returning it despite there being a new defect, this would entail a harm on the seller. And إلا أن تكون تجارة عن تراض منكم, and the wasf of تراضي, of mutual agreement, would be lifted. And there's the governing principle, لا ضرر ولا ضرار, the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, right? There's no harming nor accepting harm, right? إلا أن يرضى البائع أن يأخذه بعيبه, unless the seller, the بائع, accepts to take it back with the defect. لأنه أسقط حقه, because there he has foregone his right not to accept harm. Right? But the seller, demanding this, sort of forcing the buyer, forcing the seller to accept a refund, and many people do this in transaction. They'll be very aggressive, and the other person agreed, but reluctantly, where they did not have to agree. One thing is to make an aggressive sale. Right? I wanted to sell this mic for $150. The sister negotiated hard. You bought it for $65. I feel like you robbed me. That's your right. But let's say you bought it and then you discovered, there's a defect in it, but you dropped it, so you left a mark. Now you say, if you don't accept to take a refund, I'm going to tell the whole world that you're a lousy seller. Okay. So I accept the refund. There's a difference between the two scenarios, right? In one, it was just negotiation. If I didn't like the price that you negotiated, I would just have walked away from the transaction. That kind of aggressive negotiation is not makruh. But the Prophet ﷺ said, لا يحل مال امرئ مسلم إلا بطيب نفس منه. The wealth of another is not permitted except with their willful acceptance. So when you pressure someone to accept a refund, for example, on threat that you're going to, wrongfully, name and shame them, give them a bad review unreasonably, etc. So sometimes a bad review is permissible. Right? Now, if it's just incidental once, right, then it'd be recommended not to give a bad review, seeking good for the other party. But if it's something flagrantly bad or ongoing, then a bad review, you may be rewarded for it. Why? To caution other people, intending that the person improve their service. It'd be in itself superior just to advise them directly, but there's a consideration to tell other people, right? But it needs some thought. The default is satr. Man satara musliman satarahu Allah fi dunya al-akhirah. Whoever conceals the faults of another, Allah conceals their faults on this life and the next. But there's a consideration in bad reviews between a satr wa nusх. right? Between concealing the faults of another, but also seeking good for others, right? So you have to balance where is the consideration of just concealing another's fault. You didn't like it, just don't say anything about it. Move on. But sometimes there could be an interest. Like you walk by the kitchen and saw that it's extremely unhygienic. In some cases, you could report a restaurant, for example. It should close down a lot of halal places, but I don't know if, there's this, in Mississauga, they keep Mississauga News and this thing called insaga.com. They keep announcing what restaurants got closed each month. And sadly, it's so common that halal restaurants and Chinese restaurants keep getting shut down. You could say it's racist. We could just say that we got to be more careful. Anyways, so that's a point of ethics to be aware of, right? You can't demand something that's not rightfully yours. If a person accepts it, it's not actually a hadith, I don't think, but it is from the words of the early Muslims, as according to Mufti Taqi Usmani. They said that كل مال أخذ بسيف الحياء فهو حرام. Any mal, anything of value taken with the sword of shyness is haram, which would apply in transactions. Like, sell me this for this much, otherwise I'm going to do this to you. And the person sells it. That was not a halal transaction. It also applies to fundraising. One of the great scholars of India, because people always don't support religious causes and stuff, particularly things like education and so on. So many madrasas historically were if they didn't have big funding, the students would go and raise funds. They'd even go to the marketplace. Something, especially in the subcontinent, they would do, because you have to be practical. You have to establish madaris. You can't just sit there and say, well, no one funds us. So they would send the students to the marketplace to tell the businessmen to donate seasonally. So one of the great scholars of the Indian subcontinent, early 20th century, he asked the students at the madrasa, how were they raising money? And he realized that it had become the habit of the madrasa to be very aggressive in asking the businessmen for money. So he said that it has come from the early Muslims that كل مال أخذ بسيف الحياء فهو حرام. All money taken with the sword of shyness is impermissible. So he forced them to go back to the marketplace and give every rupee that was raised back to everyone who raised it, and to announce that we did this and we apologize. And that requires caution. And some fundraisers behave badly when it comes to that. Okay. So he says, وَإِنْ قَطَعَ الْمُشْتَرِي الثَّوْبَ فَوَجَدَ بِهِ عَيْبًا رَجَعَ بِالْعَيْبِ. Right? If the buyer, the mushtari, cuts the garment, then discovers a defect, then one رجع بالعيب أي رجع بالنقصان القيمة الناشئة بالعيب. They go back to the buyer demanding the differential in value. Right? So you got some garment, you cut it, and then you discovered that the cloth, if you tug at it, becomes loose. Once you've cut it, you cannot refund it. Rather, you would seek the diminishment in value, which either the two parties agree to, or they get an arbitrator, or they take it to court. So this is where it diminished the value. But what if there's a ziyada fil mabi'a? What if there's an addition in the item of sale? So he says, وَإِن لَتَّ السَّوِيقَ بِسَمْنٍ. Right? So the sawiq, which is if one put fat in if one coated the flour with fat, and they would do this to preserve it, right? ثم اطلع على عيب رجع بنقصانه. If one mixed the flour with samn, with fat or oil, like ghee, okay? And then one discovered that the flour had some defect in it. Then you go back with the diminishment in value. وَلَيْسَ لِلْبَائِعِ أَنْ يَأْخُذَهُ. In this case, the buyer does not have the right to take it back. Why? Because it resembles riba. Right? Meaning, وَلَوْ رَضِيَ بِالْعَيْبِ الْحَادِثِ. Right? Even if one accepts the blemish. And you can see this, Majalla item 340. Why? Because it's as if, at the end of it, it's as if the seller gave some wheat and then took back wheat plus the saman, the ghee. So that's like riba. Right? So he could not accept it, even if both parties agree, because it has the meaning of riba. And that's why it's so important that something seems fine. But as they mention, as Sayyidina Umar ibn al-Khattab said, that لا يدخل سوقنا من لم يتفقه في ديننا. No one may enter our marketplace if they've not gained understanding of our religion. فإنه يقع في الربا شاء أم أبى. Otherwise they'll fall into riba if they want to or not. This is an example. And even though both parties agree, taking that back in that situation would have the meaning of riba, and the refund would be valid, but both parties would have incurred sin. And similarly, and we'll be coming to al-bay' al-fasid, they say al-bay' al-fasid fi hukm al-riba. All corrupt transactions are akin to riba. Okay? And at least some of the grave sin of riba applies to them. Okay. ومن اشترى عبدا فأعتقه أو مات ثم اطلع على عيب رجع بنقصانه. Whoever buys a slave and then frees the slave, or the slave died, then one discovers a defect, one still has the right to demand the diminishment in value, if they wish. Right? فإن قتل المشتري العبد, but if the buyer, the mushtari, killed the slave, of course, which is a major sin like any other. أو كان طعاما فأكله. Of course, not the abd was طعام. أو كان المبيع طعاما. Right? Or the item of sale, not the slave, was food, and the buyer ate the mabi'a, not the slave, of course. لم يرجع عليه بشيء. In that case, the buyer has no right of diminishment of value. Right? So you bought a cake and you ate the whole cake. Then you discovered that it was beyond the expiry date. You ate it, خلاص, there's no refund. وقال أبو يوسف ومحمد يرجع. But Abu Yusuf and Muhammad both said you have the right of demanding the diminishment in value. Right? And there's quite a bit of detail related to this. And there's actually some distinction between the opinion of Muhammad and Abu Yusuf in this issue. But the fatwa, they said, is on the opinion of Imam Muhammad. This is related in Al-Bahr al-Ra'iq, quoting the ikhtiyar. And if the ikhtiyar of al-Mawsili ever chooses an opinion other than that of Imam Abu Hanifa, it's like, it's a very rare event, because al-Mawsili in the ikhtiyar almost inevitably, even when many others chose other than the opinion of Abu Hanifa, he sticks almost inevitably to the opinions of Imam Abu Hanifa. But a handful of issues he does, and those are very noteworthy. Right? If he chose it, means that there's probably really, really good reason to choose it. So and you can find detail in this in the Majalla, items 354 and 355. Right? Related to going back on this. So this is, let's say you started eating the cake. The position of Muhammad basically, let's say you got a cake. Started eating it, then you realized that the cake is stale because it's expired. Then you can refund the cake, except for the amount that you already ate, and demand the diminishment in value, right? So right, and you can see the item, and likewise, in this mention in the Tanwir, شرى نحو بيض وبطيخ فكسره فوجده فاسدا ينتفع به فله نقصانه. If one bought an egg and broke it and found it to be fasid, right? Not to be sound, or you bought a watermelon and inside it was rotten or something, if it's still considered to have material value, even if it be to feed animals or something, then you can demand the diminishment of value, because you can't refund the broken egg. But if it still has value, right, that it could be used as animal feed or something, then فَلَهُ نُقْصَانُهُ وَإِن لَمْ يُنْتَفَعْ بِهِ أَصْلًا. But if it's such that there's no benefit to it, right, such that it could not even be given to animals or anything, it has zero market value, then one can demand a full refund. فَلَهُ كُلُّ الثَّمَنِ. Because in that case, the item of sale was not of material value. لِبُطْلَانِ الْبَيْعِ. This is Hashiyah ibn Abdin, volume 4, page 85. Then to close the section, he says, وَمَنْ بَاعَ عَبْدًا فَبَاعَهُ الْمُشْتَرِي ثُمَّ رُدَّ عَلَيْهِ بِعَيْبٍ فَإِنْ قَبِلَهُ بِقَضَاءِ الْقَاضِي فَلَهُ أَنْ يَرُدَّهُ عَلَى بَائِعِهِ وَإِنْ قَبِلَهُ بِغَيْرِ قَضَاءِ الْقَاضِي فَلَيْسَ لَهُ أَنْ يَرُدَّهُ. Okay. من باع عبدا, whoever sells a slave, and then the buyer sells it to a third party. So A sold a slave to B, and B sold it to C. And then it was returned to him, meaning to B, due to a defect. Can B now demand to return, demand refund for the defect, for the aib from A? He says, فَلَهُ أَنْ يَرُدَّهُ, if B accepted the refund due to the qada of a qadi, right, due to the judgment of a judge, then he can go back to A, to the original seller. Why? Because qada al-qadi faskhun min aslihi. Because, A sold to B, B sold to C. C discovered there's a defect, so he demanded return to B. If B accepted it due to a legal judgment in court, then what the court judgment is akin to that transaction between B and C being annulled. So because the transaction between B and C was annulled, then B can now go back to A, because the defect existed with number A. However, when B sold the item, right? Selling an item entails accepting how it is, right? So the sister here bought the mic from me. It's got a defect, and then you went and sold it. The act of selling something is accepting the item as it is, and then now you're selling it on, right? But if B accepted the item to be refunded from C due to the defect, just willfully, then the fact remains that his choice to sell it entailed that he accepted the defect implicitly. So then he cannot demand that A, who is the al-ba'i' al-asli, the original seller, refund the item to him. And that is because the khiyarul aib, everything that entails acceptance of the blemish ends the khiyarul aib, right? يعني كل تصرف so once you've seen the blemish, the defect, and then you use it in the way that an owner uses something, entails implicitly. So let's say you bought the mic from me for the aggressive price. You saw the defect and you started using it. The fact that once you saw the defect, you started using it without seeking a refund entails that you accepted the defect. Because if you wanted to exercise your right of return for the defect, you should not have used it. That's the option of cancellation due to defect, as opposed to a return policy. A return policy is a condition in the contract. It is not the option of cancellation due to defect. And amongst the things that is considered accepting the defect is is offering it for sale, offering the item for sale. And you can see details of this in Hashid ibn Abdin, volume 4, page 90. Okay. So that's a section on the option of defect. And in Ibn Abdin, volume 4, page 98, he mentions a fara. Actually, it's in the Dur al-Mukhtar, but in Hashd al-Abdin, you can find it, volume 4, page 98. He says, لا يحل كتمان العيب في مبيع أو ثمن. It is not permissible to hide a defect in the item of sale or in the price. لأن الغش حرام, because cheating is prohibited. Right? So here, concealing defects is considered to be from deception, ghish. And the Prophet ﷺ, of course, and they mentioned this ta'leel. And what did the Prophet ﷺ say about ghish? Man ghasha falaysa minna. Whoever cheats is not of us, meaning is not following the way of uprightness that the Prophet ﷺ has come with. Right? So this is this is an important component related to Ayub. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. Then he says باب البيع الفاسد. This is one of the most important chapters in fiqh al-mu'amalat. So please do prepare well for it. بإذن الله. And the bay' al-fasid is a sin, right? Hashid ibn Abdin, volume 4, page 29, right? He mentions, وَهُوَ مَعْصِيَةٌ يَجْبُ رَفْعُهَا. It's a sin that it is obligatory to lift. And we'll see how the sin of entering into a corrupt transaction is lifted, either by cancellation or correction. Right? وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وسلم والحمد لله رب العالمين. Yours? Oh, sorry, I missed one. ومن اشترى عبدا وشرط البراءة من كل عيب فليس له أن يرده بعيب. Whoever buys a slave, مثلا, for example, and stipulated as a condition that one is free of responsibility for any fault, then the buyer cannot return them for any fault. وَإِن لَمْ يُسَمِّ الْعُيُوبَ وَلَمْ يَعُدَّهَا. Even if one did not name nor enumerated the defects. Right? This is within the bounds of what is customary. Right? Because let's say you sold a computer and said, I'm not responsible for any faults, but turns out it doesn't have a chip, it doesn't have a processor in it. Right? That's not considered a defect. That's considered to be fawatul maqsood. Right? And you've vitiated the purpose, because without a processor, it's not considered to be a computer. I'm selling this car as is. Looks good. You just bought it. Turns out there's no engine in it. Right? So that would not be encompassed by, well, that would not be being free of defects. That's considered to be khiyaru fawatil wasf. Right? That it's missing an essential quality. And that's discussed in the Majalla. Jazakallah khair for pointing that out. Okay.